Warpugs! It's time for more Siege of Vraks. This is the Crisis on Vraks. And this is when everybody really finds out that, well, there's more going on on Vraks than really anyone needed to know about. And all the questions that I got asked as to why this place was so well defended and why the Vraxxians seem to do so well against the Krieg guardsmen. All that really gets answered right about now, I do believe, if I'm looking at the thumbnail correctly. Oh boy, let's just jump into it, guys. Janovich, he's going to kill me. All of his links are in the description down below. I 100% recommend that you go check him out. He not only has done this, he's done an excellent trailer. Well, not trailer, a video for Vraks itself. And in my mind, it's one of the best videos for the Death Corps of Krieg out of all the ones that have been done. Let's get into it.
Subsector Keller!
Due to the tenacious Vraxxian resistance, the siege plans of the 88th Siege Army were now way behind schedule. What had initially been expected to be a relatively easy campaign against unorganized rebels turned out to be a long war of attrition against a well-defended and a very well-organized foe.
Yes!
But finally, after more than 2 years into the Siege of Vraks, the Death Corps of Krieg had at last achieved their very first breakthrough at Fort A453. To make up for the delays, Imperial High Command now spared no expense in order to exploit this breakthrough. Finally, the heavy armor divisions could be put to good use on the plains of the Van Miersland wastes. Armored columns streamed through the gap and relentlessly rolled up on the flanks of the Vraxxians' outer defensive lines. The Vraxxian defenders were unable to hold their positions against this overpowering tide of enemy armor rushing through the break in their lines. Vraxxian command was now afraid that the bulk of their army would be completely outflanked and overrun. In order to prevent this catastrophe, they ordered the complete abandonment of the outer defensive lines. With surprising competence, they swiftly managed to orchestrate a general retreat back to
Very surprising competence.
their second defensive lines, where they would prepare for the next stage of the siege. All in all, the Vraxxian army retreated in good order, taking with them as much weapons and material as they could. But despite the necessary retreat now, Vraxxian command remained confident. Against all odds, they had heroically stood against the fierce Imperial war machine for more than 2 years already. Although costly, one unlucky breakthrough would not shatter their morale now. As soon as the general retreat had been completed, they would teach the Imperium about the unwavering Vraxxian tenacity once more. The entire 88th Siege Army now moved over largely undefended terrain with the intent of encircling the second defensive line. With the Vraxxian army in retreat, perhaps a hasty assault could catch the defenders off guard and overrun the second defensive lines while they were still relatively unorganized in their new defenses. And so, the Death Corps troops left behind their own well-defended trench lines and transported most of their equipment over the Van Miersland wastes in order to catch up with the retreating Vraxxians and continue their attack as soon as possible. But although the overall length of the front lines would now drastically shrink, the 1st Line Corps in the northern sector would now have to stretch their troops over quite a significant distance to cover the entirety of the northern part of the 2nd defensive line in order to completely encircle the enemy. Fortunately, during these 2 years of siege, the 1st Line Corps had mostly waited for a breakthrough to happen in the west before committing their forces to breaking the northern defensive line. And so, in comparison to the other line corps, they had suffered very little losses, and all in all, the regiments of the 1st Line Corps were in great shape. They had enough troops ready to cover the length of their new front.
Yay!
As such, the 5th, 15th, 3rd, and 19th regiments moved forward to finally do their proper part in the siege. It was up to the 19th regiment to cover the most eastern part of the line, and so the regiment moved towards Heb Zone 1. They approached the new terrain carefully. A counterattack was always a possibility, especially over open terrain like this.
Yep.
But they didn't expect much resistance, as most Death Rider reconnaissance and intelligence had indicated that the Vraxxian retreat had mostly headed straight for the safety of the 2nd defensive line. Unbeknownst to the 88th Siege Army, however, the Vraxxians had already organized a plan to counterattack the Death Corps advance and catch them off guard outside the safety of their trenches.
Right.
During the retreat, they had actually diverted a large mass of tanks and artillery that were now hidden in the urban environment of Heb Zone 1. They had also brought up a large portion of infantry and armor from the now largely useless eastern defensive lines. This substantial force was lying in wait for the flanks of the Imperial forces to come closer.
This was almost an absolute disaster. This came very close to being an outright rout.
This would be their first large-scale offensive, and Vraxian command was confident it could even turn the tide of the war. Once the flank of the Imperial forces approached close to the Heb Zone, they would strike with full force and use their mass amounts of mechanized troops to roll up the rear of the advancing enemies, just like the Imperium had done to them at the breakthrough of Fort A453. With the 88th Siege Army transporting over the plains in pursuit of the Vraxians, they would be able to catch them off guard and drive them back over the Van Miersland wastes and perhaps even recapture the outer defensive lines. All Vraxian troops in Heb Zone 1 were ready for the assault. But to their surprise, the Death Corps 19th Regiment halted before springing the trap that was set up for them. Instead of directly bypassing the Heb Zone and moving straight onto the 2nd defensive line, the 1st Line Corps had chosen to exercise caution, and they started to dig in at the end of the first day's advance, setting up a light defensive trench network and only choosing to continue their advance the next day when more reconnaissance could be done.
You see, there's this perception about Krieg as being absolutely reckless with their lives. They are not reckless with their lives. They just don't have a problem with dying. They have a problem with dying needlessly. So there's a bunch of memes about how excited a Kriegsman would be to die. They're all true. But you're looking at it from the wrong standpoint. A Kriegsman wants to make his death mean something significant. So they're not going to run into an engagement where there is absolutely no hope unless of course they've been directed to. But they're not going to needlessly sell their lives or the lives of the men underneath their command for no reason. They're an elite military formation for a reason.
They had not been as reckless as the Vraxian command had anticipated. The Vraxians started to doubt the strategic soundness of their own offensive. Perhaps the Death Corps weren't planning to completely encircle the 2nd defensive line after all. And if the Vraxians allowed them time to dig in here and now, that would greatly diminish the potential success of this crucial counter-offensive. This, of course, couldn't be allowed to happen, and they considered launching their attack sooner rather than later to prevent the Death Corps from digging in even further and gaining a new foothold. Being unwilling to let their plan go to waste, they signaled the attack to begin. Their artillery opened up on the fresh trench lines of the 19th Regiment, and the overwhelming amounts of Vraxian armor rolled forward from their concealed positions in the Heb Zone and raced over the plains towards their enemy. They hit the front of the Death Corps 19th Regiment hard. With their guns blazing, squadrons of Lehman Russes and Chimeras rolled into the newly dug trench lines where they disembarked their infantry. Chaotic melee broke out, while the tanks destroyed the unready defenses piecemeal. Whole Death Corps squads were buried alive in their collapsing trenches, and large parts of the regiment vanished in the sudden maelstrom of explosions and shrapnel.
If it hadn't been for the fact they had to offload their troops there, they could have rolled the entire line.
When the attack began, large parts of the 9th Regiment had still been transporting their weaponry over the plains. Transport columns of artillery were now caught out in the open, and at risk of being destroyed, or even worse, captured. Colonel Adel, commander of the 9th Company, quickly gave out orders for a hasty withdrawal, and all over the battlefield Centaur carriers rushed back with their artillery pieces. Any guns that had to be abandoned were ordered to be sabotaged by exploding a few crack grenades into their barrels, thus successfully scuttling the weapon so they wouldn't fall into Vraxxian hands. But the armored advance of the Vraxxians was fast and relentless. They hunted down the surprised enemy all over the plains, and whenever they managed to capture any Imperial artillery, they directly turned them around to fire them into the retreating Death Corps forces. The 19th Regiment's reserves were quickly brought up to stem the tide, and tank duels took place all over the battlefield. There was no longer a single coherent front line, and the local command center was at risk of being overrun. Colonel Adel tried to contact High Command to ask for reinforcements, but the communication lines had already been severed by the intense artillery fire. So he opted to send out runners and prepared to hunker down in their last defensive position to buy time for the rest of the 1st Line Corps to respond to this onslaught. Until at last, Vraxxian hellhounds reached the command post and blasted the position with their superheated promethium, incinerating Colonel Adel and all of his command staff.
Yep.
With their command completely wiped out, the position of the 19th Regiment would not be able to recover. The regiment was soon all but wiped out, and the few straggling survivors tried to retreat all the way back to the safety of their first defensive lines. Meanwhile, the runners arrived, and the 15th and 3rd Regiment received the news of the enemy offensive. They quickly prepared themselves to face the onslaught. With the 19th Regiment out of the way, the Vraxxian spearhead was coming straight for them. If they wished to hold out, they would have to dig in swiftly. In order to give the infantry and artillery time to prepare the defenses they would need, they sent in the limited number of tank brigades they had left in hopes of delaying the Vraxxian advance. Unfortunately, the Imperial tanks
It's like pissing into the wind.
were too heavily outnumbered. In their desperation, it was decided that the tanks would be assisted by squadrons of Death Riders. On their large, noble mounts, they rode out alongside the tanks, facing the heavy enemy fire, and they attacked the Vraxxian armor with their explosive lances with varying degrees of success. Their losses were extremely severe, and many Death Rider squadrons were completely wiped out.
That's kind of normal for the Death Riders anyway.
But they had also managed to inflict losses on the Vraxxians themselves. Even a battle tank couldn't stand up to several direct hits of explosive lances against its hull. Their sacrifice had not been enough to hold the enemy's advance completely, but at the very least, the armored thrust had been blunted.
Yes.
The reckless bravery of the Death Riders had delivered the 1st Line Corps the breathing space it had needed to survive, for now. This went on for several days, with retreats and counterattacks, but with the infantry now fully dug in, the artillery in place, and the heavy tanks of the 8th Assault Corps coming up from behind, the enemy advance was finally completely halted, and the front lines firmly secured once more. The Vraxxians had tried hard to break their enemies, but through a swift response and sacrifice, the total collapse of the 1st Line Corps had been narrowly avoided, and a complete disaster for the 88th Siege Army had been prevented.
If they had allowed the Vraxxians to go, if they had allowed the Krieg to completely encircle this line right here, when they came out, they would have attacked almost half of the line corps directly in the rear. And it would have completely, if not wiped out the entire 12th Line Corps, it would have depleted it to the point where it couldn't be sustained anymore. And also, the Vraks could have very well rolled up the entire line here.
But the shock of the Vraxxian surprise attack had still disrupted the entire Death Corps campaign plan. All along the lines, the advance had been halted in anticipation of the outcome of the battle up north. With the front lines stabilized, now the assault could continue once more. But any hopes of catching the Vraxxians unprepared and unorganized in their new defensive lines were dashed away. These few days of delay had given the defenders time to effectively distribute their retreating forces and properly establish their defenses. And so, High Command of the 88th Siege Army gave up on their hopes for a swift pursuit and prepared their new trench network in front of the second defensive line. Everyone was well aware that this meant the merciless grinding stalemate would continue once again.
Yep.
In the north, the 1st Line Corps was slowly being reinforced with new recruits from Krieg, and over time, the decimated 19th Regiment was renewed to its original full size once more. They pushed forward again, now passing along the many rusting hulks and remains of tanks and artillery that were lost during the big Vraxxian offensive and scattered about the battlefield. The enemy continued to skirmish, but without the protection of their deep bunker network of the defensive lines, they could simply not stand up to the replenished Death Corps forces. Slowly, the ground lost to the counterattack was being reclaimed. The area of Heb Zone 1 was eventually completely pulverized by artillery fire and wiped off the map for good measure. After more than a year, the Vraxxian defenders were finally completely pushed back, and the 1st Line Corps was in position to encircle the 2nd defensive line. The second stage of the siege was about to begin. By now, the campaign was already 7 years ongoing. With only 5 more years to complete it within the original 12-year time frame, the siege continued to be severely behind schedule, and the end was nowhere in sight. This delay incentivized the desperate High Command to come up with new ideas to complement the current campaign strategy. Although a significant amount of orbital defense lasers and anti-air defenses were already in Imperial hands, too many were still in territory held by the Vraxxians. If more of them could be captured or outright destroyed, then perhaps the limited aerial bombardments could be carried out and potentially speed up the campaign. And thus it was now that, alongside the standard siege doctrine, small-scale raiding tactics were introduced to a much greater extent than before, with the intent of identifying the location of air defenses and attempting to take them out. All along the front lines, elite grenadier units were instructed to conduct small nightly raids to gain information and sabotage the enemy's defenses wherever possible.
So, this is quite possibly, I'm loving the way he's done this so far. I'm just pausing that just to basically say I can appreciate how this was done. I wish I knew how to do programs like this. I would love to do something like this for Armageddon. I would love to do something just like this for Armageddon.
On one such raid, a few grenadiers had managed to cross no man's land and sneak into an underground bunker complex. Here, they had located one of the major laser defense silos. But the small raiding squad estimated that they had too few troops to overtake and destroy the facility on their own. So in the cover of darkness, they signaled back to the front lines, requesting immediate reinforcements to help take it out. The importance of destroying one of the main laser defense silos would not be overlooked by command. Soon, several Gorgon heavy transports had been filled up to the brim with heavily armored grenadiers and attempted to cross no man's land in the cover of darkness. When the transports approached close to the enemy front lines, they were eventually spotted and fired upon. But the thick steel armor of the Gorgons was more than capable of brushing off the enemy's weapon fire, and before artillery could be called on their location, they had already reached the enemy's lines. When they got close enough to the bunker complex, the ramps lowered and the grenadiers rushed towards the laser silo. Soon they would overtake the defenses and blow up the facility before quickly rushing back to the safety of their own lines. Well protected by their flak armor and with their heavy weapons, the overwhelming force of elite grenadiers easily took out the unprepared defenders. But as they made their way inside, they were suddenly flanked by bolter fire.
Uh-oh. SpaghettiOs.
To their surprise, Space Marines in blue-tinted armor blocked their way into the facility. While they had been more than capable of taking out the Vraxxian militia defenders before, these Astartes were a different matter entirely.
Yes.
Before long, many of the infiltrating grenadiers had been killed. With the raiding mission now completely hopeless, they decided to call off the attack and withdraw back to their own lines. But when they withdrew, they found that their Gorgon heavy transport had already been destroyed. They had walked right into a trap laid by the Space Marines and found themselves being almost completely surrounded. The Space Marines moved in and slaughtered the Grenadiers one by one. Through incredible luck, a few of them managed to free themselves from the ambush and escaped into the darkness of no man's land back to their own lines, where they informed their local commander of what had happened during the raid. The drastic news was then relayed back to Lord Commander Julka's command center back on Thracian Primaris.
So, if you were sitting here wondering how the Vraxians suddenly got so good at defending, it really wasn't them, was it now?
If the reports were to be believed, this new development of the front was very disturbing indeed. Space Marines had apparently reinforced the side of the Vraxian defenders, but how was this possible? Vraks had been completely cut off by the Imperial fleet blockading the planet in space. No one should be able to get in or out without the permission. Julka contacted the Lord Commander Militant of the Segmentum Obscurus to ask if the mysterious Space Marine chapter could be identified. All the Astartes chapters in the Segmentum that wore blue were contacted, but they were all able to account for the whereabouts of their companies. No missing troops or rogue elements had been reported back. It was thus assumed that the Space Marines that had been spotted on Vraks were likely to the traitor legionaries. But Julka still had no answers to the mystery as to how they had bypassed the blockade and managed to arrive on the planet at all. In the meantime, however, Julka also requested the reinforcement of a whole new line corps from Krieg to join the fighting on Vraks, as these new troops would surely help break the stalemate so they could smash through the second defensive line. Of course, the arrival of traitor Space Marines had been severely concerning.
Yes.
But under Julka's command, surely such a lousy mistake in security would not be allowed to happen a second time.
It would.
He would simply plead with the Munitorum for extra ships to guard the planet. Then he would sternly order Admiral Reziak to tighten his blockade of space around the planet and make sure that it was absolutely impossible for other traitorous troops to make planetfall. The Vraxians would not be reinforced again. But there was good news as well. Due to Julka's influential relationships within the Imperium, his request for reinforcements from Krieg had swiftly been approved.
Swiftly, in Imperial terms.
This time, the 34th Line Corps with 3 regiments had been mustered and would soon depart for Vraks. So far, the siege had been long, hard, and incredibly bloody. But surely, with so many extra Death Corps soldiers on their way, victory was at this point assured. Right now,
Surely.
it was only a matter of time.
This goes on for a while. And soon we're going to have another group of Space Marines show up. Oh, very next episode. Yes. I love the Dark Angels, the way they're portrayed in this battle, because the way they're portrayed in this battle is... I'm not going to say it this round. I'll tell you guys next. I'll tell you guys the next one. I'll tell you guys on the next episode, because, frankly, it's rather hilarious. They just show everybody's confused. Everyone is confused. No one really knows why they did what they did. Guys, all links are going to be in the description down below. I 1000% recommend that you check this out. Um, so there is a lot that goes into the Siege of Vrax. It is one of the I'm introducing my wife to the Siege of Vrax at this point because it's always fun to be able to tell her all this weird stuff. I actually got a chance to show her the video last night that Janovich made, and it is one of those things, those happy feelings that you get when you get to introduce somebody into something that you find completely awesome. In any case, thank you guys for joining me. I'll see you again soon. And you gotta love Krieg. You just gotta love it.